This is what my game looked like at the start of this month. It's only a few months into development, but its gameplay is based around an idea I had. Could I distill many of the elements of a fantasy RPG game into a game that fits well onto a mobile device? The game I had designed was largely based around this single exploration mechanic, but eventually I realised it's not actually fun. It was just boring to play and boring to look at. So with this realisation, I decided I would need to take countermeasures. I would spend the entirety of this month's development time prototyping new ideas, making changes, and focusing religiously on a single thing: fun. I would not put any thought into code quality, graphics, or story, choosing to prioritise gameplay above everything else, because I knew that before I added more content, I had to find what was most fun about this game. But could this all be done in a single month? Well, it's certainly different now. Okay, so here's the situation. The problem with this game is that it is very predictable. The player would begin their exploration, find items, encounter enemies, and the world would gradually appear before them. But the way it did this was truly uninteresting. I knew that I would have to incorporate procedurally generated maps into the world in order to add some variety to the game. This would give the player the variation necessary in order to keep the game interesting. But it was as a result of this work, I had an idea that completely changed the gameplay. This game was far too idle. Fundamentally, there was no way for the player to alter the gameplay, as they were waiting for items to come to them. And this was the first thing I decided: I needed more player interaction. There had to be more skill and strategy about this game. The idea was this: the player can see themselves exploring around the procedurally generated world in the render window. They move from place to place, finding resources and collecting items. The first major change is that places are no longer discovered in the items tray. They are instead discovered when the player walks over them in the overworld. Secondly, enemy encounters are now based on whether the player collides with them in the overworld. Previously, encounters were completely random and the player had no actual control over them. The player had no means of avoiding encounters, so there was no real skill involved. In this new system, the player would be able to dictate what direction they're travelling in by placing location markers. This meant that if the player wanted to avoid combat altogether, there could be more tactic involved. Thirdly, having more control over the overworld would give me far more potential for gameplay changes in future. I thought this was an interesting plan, so began implementing it. Firstly, I had to optimise and fix the 3D procedure world from last month to make it performant enough so that your phone didn't just die when trying to play this game. Not only was my voxelizer a bit broken, but I had to disable all optimizations last month in order just to get it to work. I managed to fix this and get optimizations up and running after having found a few glaring issues in the code from last month. It's a bit too complex to boil down to a single sentence, but regardless, here's the diff. The jump from no neighbour mask, i.e. drawing every single voxel, to using neighbour mask to draw only visible voxels, saw an improvement of 18.9 seconds. But it can be better. The first easy optimization was that as this is terrain, I can just ignore the bottom faces altogether, netting me an improvement of 0.7 seconds. The majority of the voxels are water voxels. They don't really add anything to the gameplay, so I decided to skip submitting them to the voxelizer altogether. Instead, I would just draw a flat plane to represent the ocean. This was a significant reduction in the number of voxels, netting an improvement of 2 seconds for a total of 0.49 seconds to render the average map. In future, I'll also add chunking, which will allow me to divide up the total workload, but for now this is good enough. I then threw out my previous world visualization and got my procedural world rendering in the game, and immediately it looked more interesting than previous. I took the time to redesign the visual layout of the GUI so the rendered scene could be front and center. Then I worked to add some life to the scene by getting enemies to render. I then devised a system to spawn them in the world. Okay, that's not what it's supposed to look like. Luckily this was an easy enough fix, and I then went on to add the player character to the scene. I'd just like to point out that all these models are temporary, please don't look too closely. Now of course it makes little sense for the player to clip through the terrain like that. I built a somewhat rudimentary system to align the player to the terrain, like so. Of course in future there's potential for gameplay ideas like making the player go slower uphill, or actually smoothing the camera out so the transition isn't that jarring. I got the same thing working with the enemies and then decided I would add something that I definitely needed: collision detection. Okay, well my code to make the enemies chase the player didn't work out too well. Or it worked out really well, depending who you ask. Having fixed that, I got the collision with the player to actually trigger the combat encounter. But wait, didn't I spend some time before making a proper player combat encounter pop up? Oh yeah, here it is. With that in place, combat and the whole system flow together as you might expect. Okay, so remember that the generated maps include a list of places. So it's probably a good idea to render them in the world. With the places marked in the world, I built this system where the player can walk towards a place and it'll tell them what it is as well as give them an option to visit it. The problem with this though is that this screen still manages to crash the engine. But I do have a solution, just don't visit the places. This gameplay redesign is focused on making the game more interactive and trying to keep the player on their toes. Because of this, I experimented with making items auto-scrap themselves, if not claimed in a certain amount of time. This punishes the player for not paying attention and also makes sure that discovered items keep coming in no matter what. I did quite like this change, but also added a scrap all button to clear all the items out, although this is really just there to test. Now you might remember from the previous devlog that I had this cool inspector tool for the generated maps. Well, when I was designing this, I built it in a way that it could be used as a standalone feature with the expectation that at some point it would be used in the game itself. I felt this definitely added to the look and added this little indicator so you could see where the player was at any given time. But this is also a bit naff as it tells you where everything is. This is a game about exploration, right? Well, I experimented with using a bit mask in the map shader so that I'd be able to obfuscate bits of the map so that I could reveal them as the player actually walked around. But, well, it caused me problems. I decided to use 2 bits for each voxel as that would allow me to give some variation in how visible things actually were. But this also made trying to write to the buffer in a circular pattern a bit of a pain. I understand the problem at face value, but really I just decided to do a tactical retreat and face this issue another day. As I'm working on gameplay this month, I just decided I couldn't be bothered to deal with any of this nonsense. Now previously I've been controlling the player using WASD on the keyboard. Now you may not be aware of this, but most modern smartphones don't actually have a keyboard. So as a result, I built a system where you could tap a bit of the map on the screen and the player would walk to that location. Currently, I cast a ray to a plane at the origin rather than actually querying the terrain because that was just a bit too complicated. So the position might be a little bit off, but it's still close enough. I even added this nice flag model so the player could see where they're walking to. If the player doesn't actually want to direct their character though because say they're doing something else, then the character should just be able to walk around of its own accord. So at this point I made it so the player character will walk to a random place on the map, which is supposed to look like the character making discoveries of their own accord. But really the question is it fun yet? Well, honestly it could do with a bit more excitement. I used the coin effect I had made previously to trigger when the player encounters the place for the first time, to give this nice rewarding effect which I actually really like. I also added flags to locations which have just been encountered to make it more obvious which places have been discovered and which have not. Okay, well that's pretty good, but do you know what's not good? I really didn't like that when the player collided with an enemy they were immediately taken to the combat screen. I thought it really ruined the flow of the exploration, as you got dragged out to the screen and had to deal with all that. So I experimented with a system where enemies were queued up like this down the bottom. They were on a timer similar to items, so they would just disappear if you were careful. You could trigger the combat earlier if you wanted to get rid of them, but if you had 4 queued up, you would have no choice but to start the combat. The idea was that if you delayed the combat, you might be forced to fight a tougher fight than if you just did it earlier. Really, it's supposed to be about player choice. Although I'm still not quite happy with how combat works at the moment, so I might have to have a rethink of it in the future. Well, I decided that with the end of the month coming, I would try and close the gameplay loop as best I could. I had the idea of adding a gateway location to the map, which will control when the exploration ends. In order for the player to activate the gateway, they would have to find a certain number of places in the map. The idea was to be similar to the staircase in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, which just allowed you to get to the next floor. From a gameplay perspective, this does add some tension, as the player actually has to find the gateway item, as well as ensure that it's sufficiently charged up. I got this gateway ready or not system working, and was surprised to see that it actually looked quite nice when in the overworld. All I needed now was a nice screen which tells me what I found during the exploration. Obviously it's not perfect, but it's a fairly bare bones example of how this thing might look in future. Okay, well that was quite a lot, so this is the point now where I tell you all the things that are wrong with it. Firstly, the game code is worse, but we expected that. Secondly, I bumped into loads of stability issues in my engine, which is annoying. I can't do a full cycle of exploration and re-exploration because the setup and teardown procedure just doesn't work correctly. It just crashes. I uncovered an issue in the collision system of my engine. Turns out I can't destroy collision objects properly for some reason. A long time ago I made the ambitious decision to completely thread my physics implementation, which of course in theory makes it faster but also makes the code way more annoying to have to deal with. And turns out I uncovered an issue with that where setup and shutdown is a bit more broken than I would like it to be. This essentially made it impossible to destroy the enemies in the world, so as a result, when you collide with enemies and they disappear, what the code is actually doing is just moving them off to the corner of the world where they're in theory not going to do anything. I'll need to properly fix and unit test that in the engine at some point, which is a shame. There's also some memory issues in my GUI where sometimes when you switch one of the windows it will just crash completely, which is related to the way that I destroy the GUI objects. Because for instance, you press a button, it has to do something, so it has to send an event, and then it potentially has to destroy the button itself as part of the event, so it can get a bit complicated. So while there are quite a few issues with it, my plan is essentially just to gather all the issues together and fix them at once. But really, the most important question is it fun yet? Well, what I can say is yes, sort of. It's certainly more fun than it was at the start of this month, and maybe that's the most important thing. There's still tons to do, and I have loads more ideas for things I'd like to try. I'm still following the plan that I'd laid out in the months of this year a few videos back, so next month I'm going to try to get the world scene system working as intended. From there, I'd like to come back to this exploration system with fresh eyes and do another session of trying to improve the gameplay. But that's it for this video, so the main thing I have left to say is subscribe.